Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. We'll now begin Story 1, The Luddites, a War on the Machines. You are standing in the dim candlelight of a low-beamed cottage, somewhere in Nottinghamshire in the year 1811. The fire in the hearth is nearly out, and the loom that once provided steady work sits idle, covered in dust. The air smells of damp wool and frustration. Outside, a group of men gather under cover of darkness, faces wrapped in scarves, cudgels in hand, their target clear, the new mechanical stocking frame in the workshop just down the lane. This was the world of the Luddites, the rise of the framework knitters. To understand the Luddite movement, you must first understand the framework knitters and the world they inhabited. For much of the 18th century, the English textile trade was built on cottage industries. Skilled men like John Hardwick of Arnold would own their own looms or frames and work from home, sometimes employing their wives and children. These artisans operated independently, selling to merchants but setting their own hours and standards. Their work was hard and not always well paid, but it was theirs. These men were not, as they are often misremembered, simple laborers. They were craftsmen, trained through long apprenticeships, proud of their skill and output. But change was coming. The invasion of machinery. The Industrial Revolution was not a single moment, it was a creeping process, an erosion of an older world. For framework knitters, the threat arrived in the form of new wide knitting frames and the practice of cut-ups, where a larger piece of cloth was mechanically produced and then cut into stocking shapes, bypassing the need for finely knit pieces. These wide frames required less skill to operate. Worse still, many were run by untrained workers, including children who could be paid far less. Traditional craftsmen saw their wages fall, their bargaining power disappear, and their dignity stripped away. By 1811, frustration had turned into fury. Who was End Lud? The name Luddite comes from a shadowy, perhaps even mythical, figure, End Lud. Stories tell of an apprentice in Leicestershire who, in a fit of rage, smashed a mechanical loom sometime around 1779. Though historians disagree on whether he ever existed, his name became a rallying cry. Letters were signed in his name. Threats were issued in his voice. General Ludd became both symbol and specter, a personification of working-class defiance. Yet the Luddites themselves didn't see this as senseless destruction. To them, it was a defensive act, protecting their families, their communities, and their livelihoods from what they called fraudulent and deceitful machines. The attacks begin. The first attacks occurred in Nottinghamshire in March 1811. Small groups of men, rarely more than a dozen, would gather late at night, move silently through towns like Arnold and Bulwell, and break into workshops. They destroyed wide frames with hammers and sledges, often with terrifying efficiency. By morning, the machines would lie in splinters, and the town would wake to fear and whisper. Local magistrates were stunned. The attacks were coordinated, anonymous, and effective. Despite rewards and harsh laws, arrests were rare. Communities, often sympathetic to the Luddites, remained silent. It wasn't simply an economic protest, it was a social code. The Luddites didn't harm workers. They didn't loot. They targeted machines and the masters who refused to negotiate. They operated with a certain grim honor. But the violence was escalating. Letters, threats, and the invisible general. By the winter of 1811, Dozens of attacks had occurred. Letters, signed by End Ludd, Secretary of the Army of Redress, were sent to mill owners and magistrates. Some demanded that certain machines be removed or destroyed, else they'd be destroyed for them. These weren't idle threats. In April 1812, William Horsfall, a mill owner near Huddersfield who had openly vowed to ride up to his saddle girths in Luddite blood, was assassinated by gunfire. The government responded with force. The crackdown, Parliament responds. As attacks spread to Yorkshire and Lancashire, the British government, under Prime Minister Spencer Perceval, passed the Frame Breaking Act in 1812. This law made machine breaking a capital offense punishable by death. Troops were deployed across the Midlands and the North more than were fighting Napoleon in Spain at the time. Martial law, in all but name, descended on the weaving districts. Informants were paid, and executions began. Still, the Luddites kept coming. The role of community. It's important to pause and consider how deeply woven the Luddite cause was into the fabric of their communities. These were not isolated criminals. Many Luddites were supported by neighbors who housed them, kept their secrets, or simply turned a blind eye. In a sense, the movement was as much about belonging as it was about breaking. It was about a shared sense of betrayal by machines, by employers, and by the state. Women played their role too, keeping lookouts, relaying messages, and sometimes joining the marches themselves. For a time, the Luddites became legends. But history, as always, is rarely kind to legends. A new kind of order. By late 1812, the tide was turning. The military occupation began to take its toll. Arrests increased. Trials followed. In 1813, at York, 14 Luddites were hanged in a single day. Dozens more were transported to Australia. Machine breaking declined, but the sense of loss did not. The frames remained. The wide machines continued. Wages never recovered. And so, we are left with a curious question. Was this really a war on machines or something deeper? A landscape under watch. By the spring of 1812, northern England bore the quiet tension of a battlefield. Though no formal war had been declared, it felt like one. Troops were garrisoned in textile towns from Nottingham to Leeds, their sabers gleaming as they patrolled cobbled streets. Shopkeepers closed early, and citizens walked warily, unsure whether to fear the Luddites or the law more. The government's response had grown both broader and more brutal. London's ruling class, many of whom had never seen a mill, interpreted the Luddites not as desperate workers but as dangerous revolutionaries. In an age where the French Revolution still loomed large in the British imagination, any working-class agitation looked ominously like sedition. But what was actually happening behind the shuttered windows of those quiet homes and spinning workshops? The village of Bulwell. To understand how the movement evolved, we must return to a small village not far from Nottingham. Bulwell. Once a thriving framework knitting community, Bulwell was now teetering. Its residents had seen their wages cut in half over a matter of months. Quality materials were being replaced with inferior worsted. Skilled craftsmanship was no longer valued. John Blackner, a local radical and printer, noted in his journals how entire families survived on boiled nettles and stale bread. Children's shoes were patched with cloth scraps. Women carried water from miles away when the village well ran dry. In Bulwell, as in so many places, machine breaking was a symptom, not a cause. The cause was economic humiliation. The problem of peaceful protest. The Luddites were not the only ones attempting to redress grievances. There were petitions, many, in fact. Framework knitters submitted appeals to Parliament, asking for regulation, for minimum wage standards, for controls on the new machines. These were often written in painstaking longhand and delivered by foot to London. Each was ignored. So the logic hardened. If words would not work, actions must. In some towns, Luddites issued warnings, remove your frames by Friday, or we shall do it for you. In others, they took more direct action. Frame smashing became more than destruction. It became a message carved not in ink but in splintered wood. Still, many within the movement disagreed about how far to go. Some believed violence would alienate potential allies. Others, faced with starvation, felt there was no alternative. Inside the Luddite cells. Though the Luddites are often imagined as a singular mob, in truth they operated in small, autonomous cells. Each group rarely exceeded a dozen men. Many were related by blood or marriage brothers, cousins, neighbors. Meetings were held at night, often in barns, disused chapels, or the back rooms of alehouses. Messages were passed orally or written in cipher. Few dared to speak openly. They swore oaths sometimes on a Bible, sometimes on a musket never to betray their fellows. Some of these oaths still survive in court records, pledging loyalty to King Lud and the army of redress. Their tools were simple: sledgehammers wrapped in cloth to mute the sound, metal wedges to sabotage gears, candle stubs carried in clay pots. What they lacked in firepower, they made up for in silence. The betrayers. Yet all movements carry within them the seeds of their exposure. The Crown offered rewards some as high as £100 for information leading to arrests. For many impoverished citizens, that sum equaled years of wages. And so, under pressure, cracks formed. In Huddersfield, a man named James Ashton gave up his neighbor in exchange for protection. In Nottingham, William Glover turned informant after being caught with a stolen frame part. Some informers regretted their decisions. Others did not live long enough to. Retribution was swift and secretive. Informers' homes were marked with chalk. Some were beaten, others vanished. This cycle of betrayal and revenge eroded the movement from within. The trial at York. The most infamous moment of the Luddite repression came in January 1813 at York Assizes, where 64 men were charged with various Luddite-related crimes. Of those, 14 were sentenced to death. The courtroom was packed. The judges wore powdered wigs and stern expressions. The charges ranged from frame breaking to conspiracy, arson, and in one case, murder. The men, most of them in their 20s and 30s, stood in silence as the sentences were read aloud. Some wept. Some merely bowed their heads. Public execution was still a grim spectacle in 1813. Thousands gathered to watch the hangings on the Knavesmire, the broad, open stretch outside the city walls. For some in the crowd, it was a day out. For others, it was a funeral for the working class. The government believed the executions would end the movement. They were wrong. The slow decline. After the York executions, Luddite activity did decline, but not immediately. In Lancashire and Cheshire, attacks continued into 1814 and even 1815. Yet they became smaller, more disorganized. The old networks had been compromised. The leadership, if there ever was a central one, was gone. More importantly, industrial technology continued to advance. Wide frames became cheaper. Milliners grew bolder. New methods replaced old skills. Even if the Luddites had succeeded in slowing mechanization for a moment, they could not stop the turning wheel of capital. Ironically, some former Luddites found work in the very factories they once opposed. Hunger is a powerful persuader. And so the movement faded not with a final clash, but with 1,000 quiet resignations. After the ashes, still the legacy of the Luddites lingered. In Parliament, the memory of the frame breakers haunted discussions on labor reform for decades. While they were never celebrated officially, the Luddites shaped the language of protest. Their defiance set the stage for the Chartist movement, for trade unions, and for debates on workers' rights that would simmer through the 19th century. They had no statues, no holiday, no songs sung in public, but in private homes, especially in Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, their stories were told. A grandfather would whisper to his grandson, "My father was a Luddite lad, broke frames in the winter of 12." Today, the word Luddite is often used to mock those who resist technology. Yet in 1812, it was the name of a man, real or imagined, who stood at the head of an army of the desperate. Which raises the question, were the Luddites wrong to resist, or were they merely too early in seeing what mechanization would eventually do to human labor? Shadows on the factory floor. It is now 1816. The last of the organized Luddite cells have been dispersed. Many of their members lie in shallow graves or live in silence, having traded hammers for spindles and rebellion for routine. A new generation of laborers enters the textile mills, boys and girls as young as 6, while their elders tend power looms under clanging iron belts and dusty rafters. The air in the factory is different from the cottage. It is filled with cotton fibers and machine noise that never ceases. The spinning frames never sleep, and neither, it seems, does history. The story of the Luddites did not end in the scaffold's shadow or with the burning of mills. It lived on in a quieter form as memory, as myth, and as warning. But who exactly remembered them and how? Luddism after the fact. After the peak of their activity, Luddite memory became increasingly contested. To the government and industrialists, they were vandals, criminals, or disaffected artisans resisting progress. They were deliberately painted as irrational, afraid of change, and unwilling to adapt. Pamphlets and newspapers referred to them as enemies of prosperity. Satirical illustrations depicted them in rags, clubbing machines, with the same idiocy that children might swat at clocks. Yet among working-class communities, particularly in the Midlands and North, the Luddites were something else. In hushed tones around hearths, they were remembered as heroes of principle, men who had risked everything to preserve their independence. Mothers spoke of uncles who vanished one winter night, or grandfathers who had seen the hammers fall. These stories, passed orally, were never written down in ledgers, but they lasted. And that is its own form of resistance. The industrial momentum. Mechanization didn't just continue, it accelerated. The very machines the Luddites feared became more sophisticated. By the 1830s, the rise of steam-powered factories changed everything. The factory no longer needed to be near water. Cities like Manchester and Birmingham exploded in size, becoming centers of production, soot, and slums. Workers moved not just across counties, but across countries, rural laborers flooding into cities where a single factory might employ thousands. In a strange twist of fate, many former artisans had no choice but to become machine operators. The same men who once smashed wide frames found themselves maintaining them, oiling gears and training younger hands. Yet the cost was high. Injuries were common, hours were long, breaks were few. The autonomy that had once existed in cottage industry, choosing one's own pace and clients, was gone. Work was now regulated by the rhythm of iron and steam. Was it progress? Economically, yes. Socially, the answer is murkier. The Factory Acts and early reforms. And yet, perhaps the Luddites planted a seed. By the 1830s and 1840s, the British Parliament could no longer ignore the social consequences of unfettered industrialization. The Factory Acts, beginning in 1833, marked the first real steps toward labor regulation. These acts limited child labor, restricted working hours, and demanded some oversight on factory conditions. While the Luddites themselves never lobbied for such acts, their memory hung over these debates. Reformers, especially early trade unionists, invoked their struggle not as an example to emulate, but as a warning of what happens when people are ignored. The word Luddite became a quiet signal, less of protest, more of principle. Myths, misunderstandings, and misuse. As decades passed, the meaning of the term Luddite began to shift. By the late 19th century, it was increasingly used in public discourse as a pejorative. The Victorian press would label any opponent of new inventions, be they the telegraph, steamships, or even railways, as Luddites. The term detached from its historical roots and floated freely in satire, political cartoons, and public speeches. The real Luddites, skilled tradesmen responding to wage collapse and dehumanization, were almost forgotten. In fact, the Luddite movement was not anti-technology per se. Many Luddites used tools and accepted mechanization that supported skilled labor. What they rejected was technology that devalued human dignity, stripped craftsmanship, and concentrated power into fewer hands. It wasn't technology they feared, it was its misuse. A nuance that has largely been erased. Echoes in the digital age. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the term Luddite appears again, but now in op-eds about AI, automation, and the future of work. Factory floors are replaced with data centers, weaving frames with neural networks. When cashiers are replaced by kiosks or drivers by autonomous vehicles, a familiar tension arises. What happens to the people left behind? Just as in 1812, the question isn't whether machines are bad, it's who benefits, who suffers, and what happens to those who are no longer needed in the system. Modern neo-Luddites have emerged, some activists, some ethicists, all asking the same essential questions that haunted End Lud's army of redress. Who controls the technology? Who reaps its rewards? And who is expendable? A reflection at the edge of memory. History has a curious way of sanding down its inconvenient edges. The Luddites are remembered now in most textbooks as a footnote relegated to a few paragraphs under Industrial Revolution. But if you stand still and listen in an old mill converted into flats, or a cobbled street in Nottinghamshire, you can still feel the faint echo of their protest. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet reminder that not all resistance is regressive. Sometimes it is a cry for fairness, for time, for dignity. The Luddites lost their battle, the machines stayed. But they won something else, a place in the long story of how ordinary people push back against systems too vast to bend. And that leaves us with a final, unresolved question. In our own age of automation and acceleration, who will be remembered and who will be forgotten? Story 2. Cholera and the City. Sanitation in 19th century London. A city of smoke and stench. It is the summer of 1832. You walk down Broad Street in Soho, your boots sinking slightly into a layer of mud, ash, and something less mentionable. The smell so pungent and persistent curls in the back of your throat. The Thames is swollen and brown, sluggish with the runoff of a city that has grown far too fast for its own good. London is a city on the edge. There are over 1.5 million people packed into this metropolis, and more arrive each day. But the city is not prepared. The rich retreat behind iron gates and polished brass. The poor huddle in alleys where cesspits overflow and chamber pots are emptied into the street. The night soil men, the ones who haul human waste in barrels, work only when they can keep ahead of the rising tide of filth. This is the breeding ground of cholera. But in 1832, nobody knows that yet. The mystery of the Blue Death. The disease strikes without warning. One moment a man is working at the docks. By evening he is doubled over with cramps, vomiting and excreting a strange, watery stool that resembles rice water. Within hours he is dead. His lips turn blue. His skin shrivels. There is no time for goodbyes. They call it the Blue Death. Cholera had swept through Asia and parts of Russia by the early 19th century, but when it reached Britain's shores in 1831, it caused widespread panic. There were no antibiotics, no intravenous fluids, no germ theory. Medicine, as most knew it, still relied on miasma theory, the belief that diseases were spread through foul smells or bad air. Thus, when the first major outbreak hit London in 1832, Attention was focused not on water, but on stench. And there was plenty of that. Cesspits, privies, and overflow. In 1830s London, only the wealthiest homes had rudimentary plumbing. Most relied on backyard privies, simple pits covered by a wooden seat. Some were shared by as many as 100 people in tightly packed slums. These pits would fill over time, sometimes overflowing in rainstorms. It wasn't uncommon for waste to seep through walls, or for basement tenants to find their floors bubbling with filth. Many homes also had cesspools, brick-lined holes where waste was stored until night soil men came to collect it. But many of these workers were overwhelmed, underpaid, or simply absent. In poorer neighborhoods, waste was thrown into open ditches or directly into the Thames. Children played nearby. Laundry was washed in the same water. Water was drawn for tea. Life went on until it didn't. The authorities react. When cholera first appeared in the East End, the authorities responded with a mix of fear, confusion, and cruelty. Poor neighborhoods were cordoned off. Some homes were forcibly fumigated with vinegar or tar smoke. Entire families were dragged to makeshift pest houses, where the sick and healthy were confined together. The Board of Health, hastily formed and largely ineffective, issued handbills advising citizens to avoid cold fruits, wear wool against their stomachs, and drink small amounts of gin or brandy. Burial carts began to make their way through the city at dawn, collecting bodies before they could be seen by the waking population. The poor, predictably, suffered the most. They were blamed for their own misfortune, accused of living in filth, of drinking too much, of being morally deficient. It was easier to condemn the victim than to question the system. Reverend Whitehead and the power of observation. Amid the panic, a few observers began to look more closely not just at the smell, but at the water. One was Reverend Henry Whitehead, a local clergyman and community leader in Soho. Whitehead believed in ministering to the poor personally. He knew them by name. He sat with them as they died, and he started to see a pattern. The sick, he noted, often fetched water from the same pump. Not the River Thames, not any common source, but a hand pump on Broad Street. Whitehead had no scientific training, and like most of his peers, he believed in miasma theory. But he listened to his parishioners and he observed. He made notes. He started to doubt what he had always been told. He wasn't alone. Enter John Snow. Dr. John Snow, a surgeon and early anesthetist, had long doubted the conventional wisdom of his time. He believed radically that cholera was waterborne, not airborne. His idea was ridiculed by many of his peers, who considered it laughable that something as pure as water could carry disease. But in 1854, when a devastating cholera outbreak struck Soho, Snow saw an opportunity. He went door to door collecting data. He mapped cases. He drew lines between deaths and water sources. The result was stunning. Nearly every death was clustered around one location. The Broad Street pump. The very pump Whitehead had suspected. A city in denial. When Snow presented his findings to local officials, he faced resistance. The pump was popular. Its water was said to taste sweet and fresh. But under pressure and in the face of continued deaths, the pump handle was removed. The outbreak subsided. Though this did not immediately convince the wider medical community, it became a turning point. Snow's work marked the beginning of epidemiology, the use of mapping and data to track disease. Whitehead, too, played a crucial role by interviewing residents and helping validate Snow's data. And yet, the city was still not ready to embrace the deeper problem, its infrastructure. The Thames as open sewer. In the years following Snow's research, London's water situation worsened. The 1858 heatwave caused what would come to be known as the Great Stink. The Thames reeked so badly that Parliament temporarily abandoned its riverside chambers. Curtains soaked in chloride of lime were hung over windows. the public demanded anything be done. And thus began a new chapter in sanitation, the engineering solution. But that is a story still building of blueprints, brickwork, and a man named Basil Jett who would reshape London from beneath. For now, as cholera waned temporarily, the question remained unanswered. How many more had to die before London learned to listen to its own water? The summer of the Great Stink. It was the summer of 1858 and London was wilting. A heat wave settled over the city like a wet wool blanket, stifling and inescapable. The River Thames, already heavy with waste, grew stagnant and thick. Its waters turned dark brown, bubbling in the sun. The stench was beyond description. Residents near the river described it as an intolerable nuisance. Those farther inland weren't spared either. The smell wafted through open windows, through markets, churches, schools, and into the very heart of power, the Houses of Parliament. Members of Parliament attempted to conduct sessions with vinegar-soaked handkerchiefs pressed to their faces. The newspapers dubbed it the Great Stink. For years, London had suffered from poor sanitation, but now the city could no longer ignore the problem. The smell forced the hand of the government, not moral outrage or death tolls, but the sheer, physical assault on the noses of the elite. The result was perhaps the most critical and least glamorous infrastructure project in modern history. Joseph Basil Jett, a man of brick and vision. Enter Joseph Basil Jett, a civil engineer with a meticulous mind and a tireless work ethic. Appointed as the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works, Basil Jett was not a man of headlines. He was a man of calculations, measurements, and long-term plans. And he had a vision, a sewer system that would carry waste away from London. It may sound simple now, but in the 1850s, it was nothing short of revolutionary. The idea was to build intercepting sewers, massive underground tunnels that would collect sewage from homes and streets, then carry it far downstream, away from the urban population. To many, the scale of the project was absurd. It would require over 1,100 miles of street sewers feeding into 82 miles of main intercepting sewers. All of it built by hand, with picks, shovels, and sweat. Basil Jett didn't blink. Building beneath the city. Construction began in earnest in 1859. Thousands of laborers, many of them Irish immigrants, dug, hauled, and laid brickwork beneath London's growing sprawl. They worked in narrow, airless tunnels deep below the surface, often in knee-deep sludge. The risk of collapse, gas explosions, and disease was constant. The sewers were built with egg-shaped tunnels, a design Basil Jett insisted upon. The narrow bottom allowed for flow even in low volume. The wide top accommodated surges. It was elegant and practical, two traits rarely paired in public works at the time. The bricks used, over 300 million, were laid by hand. Every inch of pipe, every angle of gradient was calculated. Basil Jett even over-engineered the sewers, doubling the capacity he thought necessary. When asked why, he famously replied, "We're only going to do this once." He was right. Pumping stations and the power of steam. Gravity alone could not carry waste over London's varied topography. Basil Jett therefore designed a system of pumping stations to lift sewage up when needed, allowing it to continue flowing toward treatment points far downstream. The most famous of these was Crossness Pumping Station, located in southeast London. It was an industrial cathedral, iron columns, high ceilings, and massive beam engines powered by steam. It was also breathtakingly beautiful. Victorian Britain often paired function with form. Even a sewage pump was treated with dignity, ornate, painted, and symbolically powerful. It showed that even the dirtiest work could be done with pride. Crossness would later become a symbol of civil engineering itself, though few Londoners at the time ever saw it. They simply knew the smell was gone. A city transformed. By 1865, much of Bazalgette's system was operational. When cholera struck again that year, the areas served by the new sewers were notably spared. Though it would take decades for germ theory to gain full acceptance, the correlation was undeniable. Cleaner water meant fewer deaths. The Thames began to recover. Fishing returned in some places. Fewer children died of diarrheal disease. Fewer women lost husbands to sudden cholera. Slum conditions didn't vanish, but they improved. And slowly, the idea that a city could protect its citizens through engineering took root. What Bazalgette achieved was not just sanitation, it was a model for public health infrastructure, long before those words existed in policy vocabulary. Resistance and reluctance. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Many elites opposed the massive expense of the sewer project. It would cost over £3 million, around £300 million in today's money. Others worried about disruption to traffic, commerce, or river navigation. But Bazalgette's work was too thorough to deny. The smell alone had silenced much of the opposition. Still, the deeper resistance came from belief systems. Miasma theory continued to hold sway for years. Even after evidence piled up in favor of waterborne transmission, doctors and officials clung to the idea of bad air. It was familiar, it was simple, it was wrong. The story of cholera and sanitation, then, is also a story about how hard it is to change the collective mind. The people who made it work. Behind every trench was a man with a shovel, a boy carrying bricks, or a woman sewing garments for laborers. The sanitation revolution was not just Bazalgette's, it belonged to the nameless thousand who risked their health and lives underground. Some died in accidents, others succumbed to disease. Their names were not etched in stone, but their work still runs beneath London's feet. You, walking today along the embankment, stroll atop their efforts. Those granite walls, those green benches, each is part of the sewer system, discreetly designed to protect, not just to decorate. Engineering as empathy. In retrospect, what makes Bazalgette's work extraordinary is not just its engineering, but its empathy. He built not for himself, but for future generations. He addressed suffering with stone, iron, and logic. He proved that even in a divided society, infrastructure could be a form of justice. Yet there was still work to do. Clean water was only one half of the equation. The city still had overcrowded slums, poor ventilation, and few hospitals. Sanitation was a beginning, not a solution. And that leaves us with another lingering question. When does a city truly become clean, not just in its pipes, but in its conscience? After the sewers, then what? By the late 1860s, much of London's main sewer infrastructure was in place. The smell had receded, the Thames was visibly clearer, and new outbreaks of cholera were significantly less deadly or, in some cases, entirely absent. But this wasn't the end of the story. It was merely a clean slate. Sanitation had conquered one battlefield. Now it had to win the peace. As people began to notice their children surviving longer, their homes smelling sweeter, and their streets running clearer, a shift took place not just in living conditions, but in thinking. For the first time, there was a growing awareness that governments had a role to play in health. But how far should that responsibility go? The social science of sewage. The late 19th century saw a new figure enter public life, the sanitary inspector. Usually clad in a dark coat and armed with notebooks, these men moved through neighborhoods checking for blocked drains, overflowing cesspools, or contaminated pumps. They issued citations. They made enemies, but they also became agents of change. Municipal boards, influenced by the success of Bazalgette's sewer system, began to pursue more ambitious reforms. Refuse collection, street cleaning, public toilets, and better regulation of slaughterhouses. It was not glamorous work. Inspectors combed through dustbins, examined fecal matter, and argued with landlords who saw maintenance as an expensive luxury. But in the long sweep of history, their work saved far more lives than any military victory, changing the narrative of responsibility. Cholera forced a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Poverty was not a moral failing, it was a structural condition. Previously, the poor had been blamed for their disease. They were thought to lack discipline, cleanliness, or God's favor. But after 1854, and certainly after 1858, the narrative began to change. Slowly, painfully, a new understanding took root. When a city lets its rivers become sewers, when landlords pack families into single rooms, when fresh water is a privilege, not a right, disease is the consequence, not the cause. This shift in thinking laid the groundwork for the public health acts of the late 19th century, including the landmark Public Health Act of 1875, which made local authorities responsible for drainage, sewage, water supply, and housing inspection. In essence, cholera gave birth to modern public health policy. Public baths, washhouses, and the right to cleanliness. With better sewers came the question, should people also have the right to be clean? In 1846, even before the full impact of cholera was understood, Parliament passed the Public Baths and Washhouses Act, which allowed boroughs to fund and operate public bath facilities. Initially controversial, why, after all, should taxpayers fund people's baths? They became increasingly accepted by mid-century. By 1877, over 200 public bathhouses had been opened across England and Wales. Some were simple buildings with tin tubs. Others, like those in Manchester or Liverpool, resembled Roman bathhouses in both style and ambition. These spaces served more than hygiene. They became centers of dignity, places where the poor could escape the grime and stigma of slum life, if only briefly. A warm bath was not just physical relief, but emotional restoration. Cleanliness, once a class marker, was becoming a public good. Resistance from the top. Yet not everyone embraced this evolution. Many in Parliament and the upper classes still balked at spending public funds on improvements for the poor. Some landlords resisted inspection. Some businesses dumped waste into rivers and paid fines as a cost of doing business. Even among reformers, class prejudice lingered. For example, while cholera outbreaks in working-class areas prompted rapid attention, outbreaks in wealthier boroughs were often treated as unfortunate anomalies, not structural failures. Still, pressure mounted. Journalists, religious leaders, and emerging scientists joined the cause. The idea of the common good, so fragile, so often ignored, began to crystallize into something firmer. Public infrastructure as a right, not a reward. Science catches up. It wasn't until the 1880s that germ theory, championed by figures like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch, gained near-universal acceptance in Britain. With it came confirmation of what John Snow had suspected decades earlier. Cholera was caused by a bacterium transmitted through contaminated water. The miasma theory, so deeply rooted in public understanding, finally gave way to microbial science. With proof came policy. Water filtration systems were introduced, chlorination followed, milk was pasteurized, refuse collection was expanded, quarantine measures were refined. Cities began thinking in systems, not silos. London had gone from being Europe's most notorious cesspool to a global model of sanitation, all in the span of 50 years. The global influence. What happened in London didn't stay in London. Cities around the world looked to its transformation as a blueprint. From New York to Calcutta, municipal planners and public health advocates cited the British experience as proof that disease was not inevitable, it could be engineered away. This inspired the City Beautiful and Garden City movements, emphasizing clean air, green spaces, and infrastructure as pillars of urban life. Of course, implementation varied. Colonial authorities often applied sanitation reforms unevenly, prioritizing European quarters over indigenous ones. But the lesson remained. How a city handles waste is a reflection of how it values life. Memory in brick and pipe. Today, much of Joseph Bazalgette's work still serves modern London. The embankments he built, the intercepting sewers he designed, and even Crossness pumping station all remain functional or preserved. They are monuments not of war, but of survival. Few people think about the sewage beneath their feet. Fewer still visit public bathhouses, now mostly obsolete. And yet, these invisible systems define modern life far more than grand statues or royal palaces. We remember battles and revolutions, but perhaps we should also remember the men who cleaned the streets, the women who demanded clean water for their children, and the engineers who made sanitation their life's work. They may not have fought with muskets, but they fought disease and they won. A modern echo. And now, in the 21st century, as cities grow again, and pandemics remind us of fragility, the echoes of cholera return. Not in the same form, but in the same lesson. Public health is public infrastructure. Clean water, clean air, access to hygiene, the management of waste, these are not luxuries. They are lifelines. And when they break, it is the poor who suffer first and longest. So perhaps the most enduring legacy of cholera in 19th century London is not the fear it spread, but the system it built. And that leads us to one final question. Will we remember the lessons of cholera when the next crisis comes, not just the pain, but the plans that saved us? Story 3. The Matchstick Girls and the Cost of Phosphorus. White phosphorus and the promise of progress. It's 1888. You're walking through the East End of London, past rows of soot-blackened brick buildings and alleyways buzzing with the chatter of children and street vendors. Above the din, a sulphurous smell cuts through the air, acrid and sweet, metallic and foul. You're nearing Bryant and May's match factory in Bow. This factory is one of the most productive in the country. It churns out millions of matches per day, packaged in neat little boxes labeled Lights of London, a miracle of industrial efficiency. But the magic behind this innovation lies in a dangerous element: white phosphorus. To strike a match was to strike modernity. But for the women and girls who worked with phosphorus every day, progress came at a terrible cost. Inside the factory gates, the Bryant and May Match Factory employed over 1,400 women and girls, some as young as 12. Most came from poor families in the surrounding neighborhoods, drawn by the promise of steady work in an otherwise unstable economy. The factory was divided into departments: box making, match dipping, drying, packing. The most dangerous of these was match dipping, the process of coating matchsticks with a paste of white phosphorus. The women sat at long wooden tables for 12-14 hours a day. They were required to keep pace with relentless quotas, several thousand matches per hour. Talking was discouraged. Breaks were rare. Fines were frequent for talking, for dropping matches, for being late. The paste, thick, pale, and chemical, clung to their fingers and seeped into their nails. Many carried the scent of it home with them. Their skin itched. Their breath soured. But the worst was yet to come. The curse of phossy jaw. White phosphorus was known to be volatile, but not all its dangers were immediate. For some girls, symptoms began as a mild toothache. The gums would swell, then recede. Over time, abscesses formed. A dull ache gave way to searing pain. Their jaws literally began to rot. The flesh blackened. Bone turned soft and brittle. Eventually, the jawbone could disintegrate entirely, leaving holes in the face or exposed bone that glowed faintly in the dark. This horrific condition was called phossy jaw. Treatment was brutal: surgical removal of the jawbone, often without proper anesthesia. There was no cure, only mutilation or death. Despite this, Bryant and May did little. Victims were quietly dismissed from work, sometimes without severance. Many died young in agony and isolation. The company denied any responsibility. Silence and surveillance. Life at the match factory was tightly controlled. Management enforced a strict disciplinary code. The girls were expected to sing at their benches to prove they were working. They were watched constantly by supervisors, by foremen, even by each other. Fines were deducted from wages for infractions as minor as dirty hands or careless laughter. One girl might lose tuppence for a tardy arrival. Another might lose sixpence for coughing near the product. Pay was already meager. A typical weekly wage was 4 to 8 shillings, barely enough to afford rent and food. And the fines calculated at management's discretion often reduced earnings to nearly nothing. The match girls were trapped, overworked, underpaid, and constantly exposed to a chemical that could kill them. Yet they endured. For many, there was no other option. The cost of dissent. Workers who spoke out against conditions were swiftly punished. Some were dismissed. Others were blacklisted. News of illness was suppressed, and deaths were attributed to natural causes or poor hygiene. Medical professionals who linked white phosphorus to jaw necrosis were dismissed as alarmists. Bryant and May argued that the problem lay with the workers themselves, unwashed, careless, or morally suspect. But beneath this narrative, a quiet rage was building. The power of the press. In June 1888, a woman named Annie Besant, a journalist and social reformer, published an article in the link titled "White Slavery in London." The article exposed the conditions inside the Bryant and May factory: the fines, the abuse, the long hours, the phosphorus poisoning. Besant had not written fiction. She had interviewed workers and confirmed every claim. The public was shocked. Bryant and May responded aggressively. They demanded that the girls sign a statement denying the article's claims. Most refused. This small act of defiance sparked something larger. A walkout begins. On July 5, 1888, roughly 200 match girls walked out of the factory. It began with a few brave voices who refused to accept the company's demand for silence. By the end of the day, the gates were shut and the girls were gathered outside in protest. They had no union, no savings, no legal protections. But they had each other. They marched through the streets of Bow, chanting and singing. Some carried signs. Others simply walked in their work aprons, heads held high. Local newspapers covered the strike, and Londoners shocked by the courage of such young women began to donate to a strike fund. Besant helped organize them. She arranged for press coverage, legal advice, and food support. The factory, under pressure, began to crack. The formation of the strike committee. The match girls elected a strike committee made up of workers from various departments. They presented a list of demands: the abolition of unfair fines, the rehearing of workers dismissed for organizing, an end to forced deductions for materials, better pay and safer working conditions. Bryant and May, stunned by the scale of public support, initially dismissed the demands, but the strike persisted. 2 weeks passed, orders backlogged, management flailed. Then quietly, the company requested a meeting. A new light. On July 16, 1888, Bryant and May agreed to meet the strike committee and accepted nearly all demands. Fines were abolished. Deductions were curtailed. Dismissed workers were reinstated. It was a stunning victory. Not only had these young, working-class women confronted one of the most powerful manufacturers in Britain, they had won. But the fight wasn't over. The deeper issue, the use of white phosphorus, remained. And that leads us to a final question for this section. How do you challenge an industry when the poison itself is the product? After the strike, the streets of Bow were quieter. By late July 1888, the chants had faded. The picket signs had been set aside. Inside the Bryant and May factory, the match girls returned to work victorious but wary. Their pay was marginally better. The fines were gone. The worst overseers had been disciplined or reassigned. It felt like progress. And yet, the threat of phossy jaw still hovered over the factory floor like a poisonous fog. Though the walkout had changed working conditions, it hadn't changed the chemistry. White phosphorus remained in use, and management had no intention of abandoning it. The match girls had won a battle, not the war. The deadly choice of profit. From a business perspective, white phosphorus was ideal. It ignited easily, stayed stable when dry, and was cheaper than alternatives. Switching to safer chemicals like red phosphorus, discovered in 1845, meant more complex production methods and additional expense. Bryant and May, like many companies of the era, chose profit over safety. They weren't alone. Across Europe and America, match factories clung to white phosphorus even as medical evidence mounted. It wasn't merely about money, it was about convenience. Employers preferred methods that required less investment in training, machinery, or worker protection. But the tide was beginning to turn. Annie Besant and the Women's Union. Following the strike's success, Annie Besant encouraged the match girls to organize more formally. In the weeks after the walkout, they established the Union of Women Matchmakers, one of the first women-led trade unions in Britain. It was revolutionary not just for its time, but for its composition. Working-class girls, many illiterate, were now holding meetings, making speeches, and negotiating labor rights. With Besant's support, they traveled outside London to speak at rallies and conferences, drawing attention to dangerous conditions across other factories. The union didn't last long. It eventually merged with other organizations, but its impact was lasting. It helped lay the foundation for a broader labor movement, one that included women, chemical safety, and grassroots organization. The international outcry. By the 1890s, reports of phossy jaw and other phosphorus-related illnesses were no longer confined to medical journals. Activists and journalists were increasingly vocal. In France, where match production was state-regulated, similar conditions existed. In Germany, match girls and boys faced the same horrors. In 1901, a series of international conferences on labor standards began addressing chemical safety. The idea was simple but radical: workers should not die for profit. The match girls' strike had helped ignite these conversations. Their experience had given journalists, politicians, and scientists a human story to attach to policy. And the campaign for a phosphorus ban gained strength. The Fabian Society and political pressure. Besant's involvement in the match girls' cause brought it to the attention of the Fabian Society, a group of intellectuals and socialists committed to gradual reform. Figures like George Bernard Shaw, Sidney Webb, and Beatrice Webb began to see factory safety as a moral imperative. They lobbied Parliament, they wrote papers, they pushed for state regulation of hazardous industries. And in 1908, after decades of delay, Parliament passed the White Phosphorus Matches Prohibition Act. It banned the manufacture, importation, and sale of matches containing white phosphorus. The match industry was forced to adapt, to invest in safer methods, retrain workers, and finally embrace the red phosphorus that had been available for half a century. The victory came too late for many. But it came. Memory and loss. By the time of the ban, many of the original match girls were middle-aged or gone. Phossy jaw had taken a toll. Records were poorly kept, but estimates suggest hundreds suffered deformities, and many more lived with chronic pain. Some women went to hospitals where parts of their faces were removed. Others were buried in unmarked graves, their deaths blamed on natural causes or obscured by poverty. The silence around their suffering was deafening. Their names rarely made it into history books. They were not war heroes. They did not hold office. But they held the line against indifference, against profit, against a society that didn't think poor women deserved safety. Lighting a movement. The legacy of the match girls reverberated beyond the factory floor. They demonstrated that young, working-class women could organize, protest, and win without waiting for permission. Their example inspired textile workers in Lancashire, seamstresses in Leeds, and even the early suffragettes, many of whom cited the match girls as proof that change could come from the bottom up. In 1910, when the Women's Social and Political Union intensified its campaign for the vote, it often invoked factory labor as a symbol of injustice. And though the connection was rarely direct, the Match Girls' strike of 1888 had laid the groundwork for women's political consciousness. They lit more than matches. They lit a path. On the factory floor again. After the ban, Bryant and May remained in operation. They continued to produce matches well into the 20th century, shifting to safer processes. The company even celebrated its history, highlighting the success of its products and the iconic nature of London's light. But inside the archives and among the footnotes, the strike of 1888 remained. The company never fully acknowledged the cost of its choices, nor the lives damaged by phosphorus. Even now, the original factory buildings some converted into housing stand quietly in Bow. They cast long shadows over streets that once rang with chants, footsteps, and courage. One wonders how many people pass them without knowing what happened there. And so we are left with a final, haunting question. If a match can start a fire, can it also illuminate the lives history tries to forget? A strike fades into history. By the early 20th century, the world had moved on. New factories, new wars, new causes. The Match Girls' strike, once a flashpoint of public attention and political commentary, slipped quietly out of common memory. The women who had walked out of Bryant and May in 1888 did not receive medals. They were not honored with monuments or parades. Many simply resumed their working lives raising children, cleaning houses, growing old. The only records of their lives were factory rolls, census entries, and death notices in local papers. But their impact, though uncelebrated, was foundational. They had proven, perhaps for the first time in industrial Britain, that a group of young, working-class women could take on a powerful corporation and win. They didn't need a union. They didn't need a political party. They didn't even need literacy. They needed only the truth, the will, and each other. How the fire spread. Though the strike had a specific target, Bryant and May, their actions rippled far beyond Bow. Within a decade, women across Britain began organizing in other industries. In 1892, Scottish textile workers staged their own protest over conditions and pay. In 1906, Leeds tailoresses formed associations demanding wage fairness. And in 1910, London laundry workers, many of them women, fought for recognition and better hours. Each movement carried echoes of the Match Girls' defiance. Often, organizers referred back to 1888 as an inspiration. Even if the specifics had faded, the idea remained. Resistance was possible, even in the face of indifference and power. By the time suffrage demonstrations became prominent, the image of the factory girl had evolved from exploited victim to agent of change. Safety becomes a standard. The ban on white phosphorus passed in 1908 wasn't just a British victory, it became a global precedent. In 1906, an international conference on match production held in Bern, Switzerland, brought together representatives from major industrial powers. They agreed to phase out white phosphorus and implement the Bern Convention, an international treaty regulating its use. For the first time, a chemical used in manufacturing was banned not because of military implications, but because of worker health. The decision helped establish the idea that governments could and should regulate workplace hazards. It was a seed that would later grow into labor laws, safety inspections, and health standards. The match girls had not intended to change international law, but their story had provided the human face of suffering, the proof policymakers needed to act. Literature, legacy, and the hidden heroines. For much of the 20th century, the match girls remained in the margins of popular history. Their story occasionally resurfaced in trade union education, socialist literature, or feminist writings, but rarely in school books or official accounts. They were not romanticized revolutionaries. They didn't write pamphlets or lead armies. They were quietly powerful, which is often the kind of power history forgets. In 1966, historian Louise Raw began researching the strike for her doctoral work. Her groundbreaking book, Striking a Light, brought new attention to the movement, reconstructing events from scattered archives, letters, and oral traditions. Raw's work helped remind the world that the match girls were not helped into activism by others, they organized themselves. Besant was vital but not the spark. The match girls were not led, they led. This reframing was important. It restored agency to the workers and corrected a long-standing assumption that change had to come from outside the working class. The factory today. The Bryant and May factory still stands in Bow, East London. It has been converted into flats and office spaces, its iconic clocktower preserved. Most passers-by have no idea what took place there over a century ago. A small plaque marks the site. It is understated. No statue, no museum, just a quiet reminder that here in the summer of 1888, a group of teenage girls made history. Occasionally, a walking tour or a commemorative event will return attention to the factory. On these days, historians and activists speak of Fosse Jaw, chemical reform, and labor justice. But more often, the building simply exists like so many places tied to struggle forgotten by most, sacred to a few. A modern reflection. The story of the match girls still resonates because their struggle feels timeless. Across the world today, millions of workers, many of them women, labor in unsafe conditions for inadequate pay. In garment factories, electronics assembly lines, or agricultural fields, the details change, but the imbalance of power remains. The match girls remind us that labor movements aren't born in policy papers or political speeches, they're born in discomfort, in shared suffering, and in the quiet decision to say no. And that decision, however small, can change the world. Lessons in the light. If you strike a match today, it flares safely, predictably. There is no poison on your fingers, no glow in your jaw, no girl coughing behind a factory gate. You light it without fear because, over a century ago, a group of women decided enough was enough. Their courage became the foundation for chemical safety, labor rights, and women's activism. They showed that history is not made only by generals or kings, but also by factory girls, walking out into the street, with nothing but their voices and each other. And so we are left with one final thought. How many hidden heroines still wait, in today's factories and fields, to be seen not as victims, but as the sparks that ignite a better future? Story 4. Child labor in the cotton mills of Lancashire. A day begins in the dark. It is a cold morning in Lancashire, around the year 1835. The sun has not yet risen. In a cramped row house with cracked windows and a dirt floor, a child of 8 years old is being shaken awake. There's no time for breakfast, just a crust of bread if she's lucky. Her mother wraps a shawl around her narrow shoulders, kisses her head quickly, and sends her off. The child walks through narrow alleys slick with rain, joining dozens of other children trudging toward the vast, looming shadow of a cotton mill. The machines are already awake. Inside, gears are turning, belts are whirring, and windows are fogged with steam. The child ties her apron, takes her place beside the spinning frames, and begins her shift. It will last from 6 in the morning until 7 at night, with only 2 short breaks. This was not unusual. It was the life of tens of thousands of children in the industrial north of England. Why children? At the height of the Industrial Revolution, Britain's cotton industry exploded. Mills in Manchester, Preston, and Bolton produced vast quantities of cloth for both domestic use and export across the empire. But these machines required a specific kind of labor. They needed speed, dexterity, obedience, and the ability to work in tight spaces. Children, especially between the ages of 6 and 12, fit the role perfectly. They were also cheap. An adult worker might earn 10 shillings a week. A child could be paid a mere 2. Families desperate for income often had little choice. Many children entered the mills before they could read or write. Some never left. The work itself. Inside the mill, the air was thick with cotton dust, which clung to the lungs and caused a condition known as bisonosis, or brown lung. The noise was constant, deafening in fact. Spinning frames, carding engines, and power looms thundered all day. Children quickly learned to lip read or use hand signals. Tasks were specific and repetitive. Younger children, called piecers, walked between machines tying broken threads, a job requiring fast fingers and complete concentration. Others acted as doffers, removing full bobbins and replacing them with empty ones. The most dangerous job, however, was that of the scavenger. These children crawled under operating machines to collect fallen cotton, often while the frames continued spinning above them. One slip and a hand or worse could be lost. Injury and death. Accidents were common, fingers caught in gears, hair pulled into shafts, legs crushed under rollers. First aid was rudimentary. Many injured children were dismissed from work, considered useless, and sent back to families who could no longer support them. Some were taken to workhouses. Others died quietly, buried without record. There were no mandatory inspections, no safety switches, no compensation. This system was not hidden. Mill owners knew the risks, lawmakers knew the practices, so did the parents. But poverty made morality a luxury. The role of the parish apprentice. Not all children in mills came from the local area. Many were parish apprentices, orphans or paupers sent from poorhouses in southern England to factories in the north. The Poor Law allowed parishes to bind children to employers, often until the age of 21. They were transported in carts or by foot, sometimes hundreds of miles, and lodged in barracks near the mills. These apprentices were essentially indentured servants. They worked longer hours, had less oversight, and were often subject to corporal punishment. Some mill owners took pride in treating their apprentices well, offering schooling on Sundays or better meals. But others ran grim regimes, where children were locked in at night and beaten for mistakes. Even in good mills, children had no power. They belonged to the machine. The justification. Supporters of child labor pointed to a kind of grim logic. Better the child work than starve. The factory is cleaner than the street. Industry teaches discipline. And to some extent, these claims had elements of truth. Mill work could mean the difference between subsistence and starvation, but it came at an enormous cost. Childhood, as we now understand it, did not exist for the children of the mills. There was no room for curiosity, imagination, or growth. Only the rhythm of the looms, the hiss of steam, and the ticking of quotas. Still, public opinion was beginning to shift. Early voices of reform. By the early 1800s, concern over child labor had reached Parliament. In 1802, the first Factory Act, the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act, attempted to regulate working hours for parish apprentices, capping them at 12 per day and requiring basic education and hygiene. But enforcement was almost non-existent. Mill owners ignored the law, inspectors were not appointed, and few cases were brought to court. More substantial efforts came in the 1830s, led by reformers like Lord Ashley, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, and Richard Osler. Osler coined the phrase Yorkshire slavery, comparing child labor in the mills to conditions endured by enslaved people abroad. He wrote fiery letters to newspapers, visited factories, and addressed packed town halls. Ashley used his position in Parliament to push for more comprehensive regulation. But the industrial lobby was powerful, and change was slow. The children speak. Despite their youth, some children found ways to make their voices heard. In 1832, a parliamentary inquiry into factory conditions gathered testimony from child workers. Their statements, collected and recorded in dry, bureaucratic language, remain some of the most haunting historical documents of the era. I am 9 years old. I go to the mill at 5 o'clock and leave at 7 in the evening. Sometimes, when I am sleepy, the overlooker hits me with a strap. My sister lost her fingers in the carding engine. She does not work now. These quiet confessions made their way into newspapers and public debates. For the first time, the invisible labor of children was made visible. The long shadow of industry. As steam powered Britain's wealth, the bodies of children helped turn the wheels. Cotton cloth became a symbol of British progress, but beneath each neatly woven piece lay the small, tired hands that made it possible. And so we are left with a painful question. What is the price of prosperity when it is measured in childhood's loss to the loom? A law without teeth. By 1833, public pressure around child labor had become impossible to ignore. Newspapers printed heartbreaking testimonies from child workers, and activists like Richard Osler and Lord Ashley were gaining traction. Parliament was forced to act. The result was the Factory Act of 1833, a landmark moment in British labor history. On paper, it was revolutionary. The act restricted the working hours of children under 13 to no more than 9 hours per day, and prohibited children under 9 from working in textile mills altogether. It also required factory owners to provide at least 2 hours of education per day for working children. To enforce the law, the government established a system of factory inspectors, a first in Britain's industrial regulation. But as was often the case in 19th century reform, the execution fell short. Loopholes and evasion. Factory owners found numerous ways to sidestep the law. Birth records were rare or non-existent among working families, so children's ages could not be easily verified. Employers simply claimed that small 10-year-olds were actually 12. The requirement for education was loosely interpreted. Some mill owners created schoolrooms on site but used them as places for children to nap or rehearse catechism by rote while still exhausted from labor. Inspections were infrequent and announced in advance. Foremen would shuffle the youngest workers out of sight or adjust the time logs for that day. In effect, the Factory Act of 1833 was more symbolic than transformative, but it had planted a seed. The idea that the state had a role in regulating private industry was taking root. The 10 Hours Movement. While Parliament wrestled with legislation, a growing grassroots movement demanded stricter reform. It coalesced into what became known as the 10 Hours Movement, a coalition of workers, clergy, reformers, and even some enlightened industrialists. Their goal was simple: limit the working day to 10 hours for all workers, including children and women. It was led in part by Lord Ashley, who spent years introducing various bills to limit hours in mills. He faced fierce opposition. Factory owners argued that shorter hours would ruin the economy, spark unemployment, and make British textiles uncompetitive abroad. Parliamentary debates were long and often bitter. Opponents of regulation used every argument from economic forecasts to paternalistic claims that working children were happier in the mills than at home. But the tide was turning. The power of public witness. What made the difference wasn't statistics or expert testimony, it was emotion. In 1837, a young girl named Sarah Carpenter appeared before a commission. Her quiet, clear answers about the pain of 13-hour days and punishments for dropping threads captivated the public. Her voice, simple and unaffected, carried more weight than a dozen political speeches. Print culture amplified the message. Cheap newspapers, political pamphlets, and even sermons spread the cause of child workers. Some mill towns had 10 hours associations, where children marched with banners, sang songs, and told their stories. They were no longer invisible. A compromise then a victory. In 1844, a new Factory Act further limited hours for children under 13 to 6.5 hours per day, and mandated medical certificates of age. It also set maximum work hours for women. But this wasn't enough for reformers. After a decade of struggle, they secured a major breakthrough. In 1847, Parliament passed the 10 Hours Act, limiting the working hours of women and young persons, 1318, to 10 hours per day in textile mills. Though it did not apply to adult men and loopholes remained, it was a significant shift. Factory discipline, once absolute, had been checked by law. For the first time itself had become a legal right. Education enters the conversation. As labor hours were reduced, new questions emerged. What should children do with their time if not work? Reformers began advocating for compulsory schooling. Education, once the domain of the wealthy or church-sponsored charity schools, was now seen as a public good and a safeguard against exploitation. In 1870, the Elementary Education Act made basic education compulsory for children aged 5–13 in England and Wales. Local school boards were created. Attendance was tracked. Though enforcement was patchy and tuition fees were still charged in some areas, it marked a shift toward a childhood defined by learning, not labor. Mills adjusted. Some opened half-time systems where children worked part of the day and studied the other. Over time, schooling won out. The resistance of industry. Not all factories complied. In some regions, particularly where oversight was weak, illegal child labor persisted. Families, still struggling in poverty, sometimes forged documents or lied about their children's age to keep wages coming in. Mill owners occasionally supported education so long as it didn't disrupt production. But many saw reforms as intrusions on their authority and portrayed labor laws as class warfare. And yet, economic necessity and legal pressure continued to erode child labor's dominance. By the 1890s, full-time work for children under 13 had largely disappeared in the British textile industry. Children remember. In later years, some former child workers gave interviews or wrote memoirs. Their recollections were not always bitter, but they were clear. "I never had time to think," one man recalled of his early days in the mills. "We sang songs to stay awake. You'd get a beating if you slowed down. My little brother died in the factory. No one asked questions." These memories, told late in life, offered a sobering look at what progress had cost. Even after reform, the scars remained. And perhaps more haunting were the voices that never told their stories, the ones who died young or who left no record behind. Reform but not redemption. By the dawn of the 20th century, child labor in British mills was largely a thing of the past. Yet the transition had taken nearly a century, and it had come not from sudden enlightenment but from a slow, grinding struggle between profit and principle. Child labor did not vanish because it was deemed immoral. It vanished because people fought over decades to expose it, regulate it, and build alternatives. And so we are left with another unsettling question. Why does it so often take generations to protect the most vulnerable among us? The mill grows quiet. By the turn of the 20th century, the familiar rhythms of the cotton mill had changed. The shrill cry of the overseer's whistle still called workers to begin their day, but the youngest among them were now far less likely to answer. Where once 6-year-olds tied threads under whirring spindles, now there were older teens, or none at all. The slow march of legislation, coupled with changing public values, had pushed child labor to the margins of British industry. The reforms had worked, though they had taken the better part of a century to fully take root. The working child, once considered necessary and even virtuous, had become an emblem of injustice. But while the factories themselves had quieted, their influence continued to echo. A shift in values. The disappearance of child labor from the mills signified more than just a policy change. It marked a profound cultural transformation. In pre-industrial society, children were economic units. On farms and in cottage industries, they contributed early and continuously. It was survival, not exploitation. But the factories revealed a stark truth. Mass production and profit demanded more than just contribution, they demanded control. This control came at the expense of childhood. As awareness grew of what was being lost, health, education, emotional well-being, the concept of childhood began to shift. It became associated not with work, but with growth, play, and learning. Childhood became something to protect. By the late 19th century, a child in school was seen as a national investment, not a family indulgence. The state began to take an active interest in children's lives, tracking attendance, mandating vaccinations, and even inspecting home conditions in some cities. In this sense, child labor's demise wasn't just a labor victory, it was the beginning of the modern welfare state. The rise of the factory system. Although child labor declined, the factory itself did not. Lancashire and the Greater Manchester region continued to thrive as global centers of textile production. The mills grew larger, more mechanized, and more complex. Adult workers, many of whom had started in the mills as children, now labored beside newer machinery with greater output and speed. But they too were shaped by the reforms born of child labor's decline. Regulated hours, mandated safety measures, and industrial inspectors all traced their origins to early efforts to protect children. In time, these protections were extended to women, then to men, and finally to the broader workforce. The factory inspectorate, once mocked and resisted, became a powerful instrument of oversight. In this way, the suffering of one group became the blueprint for a fairer workplace. Memory and memorialization. Despite the scope of child labor's impact, public memorials to those children are rare. In some old mill towns, you may find plaques or hear local history groups speak of the doffers and piecers of the past. In museums, old mill machinery is sometimes paired with black and white photos of shoeless children beside carding machines. But the national memory remains oddly silent. The child workers of the Industrial Revolution, millions of them, left few records of their own. They had no memoirs, no gravestones with epitaphs, no letters home. Their legacy lives on in regulations, not in statues. Yet in oral histories, family stories, and the physical remnants of mill buildings, traces of them remain. A rusted loom, a photograph of a missing finger, a faded factory bell. A global mirror. Today, child labor in Britain is gone in its 19th century form, but globally it persists. Across parts of South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, children still weave carpets, harvest crops, mine rare minerals, and stitch garments. Often, they do so under conditions shockingly similar to those described in Lancashire 2 centuries ago. Multinational corporations now replace mill owners. Global markets obscure direct accountability. And once again, poverty is cited as the cause and the excuse. But history offers a mirror. The same arguments once used in Parliament, they are lucky to have work. It's better than the street. We can't afford to change, still echo in boardrooms and supply chains. The lesson of Lancashire is clear. Change is possible, but only when we choose discomfort over convenience. Remembering the forgotten. In many ways, the children of the cotton mills helped forge the conscience of industrial Britain. Their suffering revealed the limits of laissez-faire economics. Their absence forced lawmakers to reimagine the relationship between profit and people. And though they were small, though they were voiceless, they pulled the first thread that unraveled a tapestry of unchecked exploitation. Their hands are invisible now, but their work is everywhere. In the school bell, not the factory horn. In the childhood afternoon, not the pre-dawn shift. In the classroom pencil, not the piecer's knife. Final reflection. The children of the mills were not anomalies, they were the foundation of modern industry. Their labor built the wealth of cities and nations. But they were also the moral breaking point, the proof that some efficiencies are too costly, some profits too cruel. And so we are left with one more question, not just for history, but for today. When does progress cease to be progress and become something else entirely when it rests on the backs of those too young to say no? Story 5. The Workhouse: Poverty, Shame, and Survival. The iron gate closes. The year is 1852, and you stand before the towering walls of a Victorian workhouse. Built from gray stone, its windows are small, its gates iron, and its silence unnerving. You've come here not to visit, but because you have no choice. Your landlord evicted you after a missed week's rent. You pawned your last coat for bread. The parish relief board has denied any more outdoor aid. The only option left is the workhouse. Your name is recorded in a ledger. Your belongings, what few you have, are taken and stored. You're washed, deloused, and issued a rough uniform. You are no longer a tenant, a laborer, or a mother. You are an inmate. You pass through a second door. The lock clicks behind you. And just like that, you are inside the poor law system. The New Poor Law and the rise of the workhouse. The New Poor Law Act of 1834 reshaped Britain's approach to poverty. In a country teeming with industrial change, rapid urbanization, and periodic economic collapse, the government sought to reduce the rising cost of supporting the poor. Outdoor relief money or food given to the needy in their homes was deemed too generous, too easily abused. The solution: make assistance so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would accept it. Thus the workhouse. Administered by boards of guardians, these institutions were designed with a guiding principle: less eligibility. Conditions inside had to be worse than the lowest paid laborer's life on the outside. In other words, poverty would be punished into submission. Who went to the workhouse? Contrary to popular imagination, the workhouse was not just for the idle or criminal. It was filled with people who had simply fallen through the cracks. Elderly men, too frail for factory work. Widows with children and no income. Orphans left behind by disease. Workers injured by machines. Unemployed laborers in times of slump. Whole families entered together but were not allowed to stay together. Upon admittance, families were split by gender and age. Husbands were sent one way, wives another, and children often placed in separate wards or schools. Many never saw one another again. Inside the walls. Life inside the workhouse was regimented to the minute. Days began at 6 a.m. with a bell. Inmates rose, washed, dressed, and reported for roll call. Meals were served in silence: gruel, bread, weak tea, maybe a potato if supplies allowed. The daily diet was designed to be nutritious but barely tolerable. There was little variety and no seasoning. Complaints were punished. Work was compulsory. For men, this meant crushing stones, picking oakum, unraveling old rope, or sawing wood. Women scrubbed floors, washed laundry, or sewed coarse uniforms. Even the elderly or disabled were expected to contribute as much as they could. Children were sent to separate workhouse schools, where they received basic instruction but also worked, often from age 7 upward. There were no holidays, no visits without permission, no escape unless discharged by the board. Discipline and dehumanization. Punishments inside the workhouse could be severe. Talking out of turn, insubordination, or laziness might lead to reduced rations, solitary confinement, or public humiliation. The rules were not just about maintaining order. They were about breaking spirit, discouraging reliance on public aid, and promoting what was called moral reform. The architecture itself enforced discipline. Hallways were narrow. Windows were placed high to limit distraction. Beds were arranged in rows with no privacy. Doors between wards remained locked. Inmates referred to it bitterly as the Bastille. It was not a refuge, it was a deterrent. Public perception and the weight of shame. Outside the walls, the workhouse loomed in the public mind as a place of failure. To enter was to admit defeat, to confess, publicly, that you could not manage on your own. Many would do anything to avoid it. Families sold furniture, pawned clothing, begged from neighbors. Even death was sometimes seen as preferable. The phrase, "I'll end up in the workhouse," became a common cry of despair. This perception was not accidental. The system was designed to create stigma. Poverty was framed as a personal flaw, not a systemic consequence. And so, many starved rather than submit. The pauper's grave. If you died inside the workhouse, and many did, you were given a pauper's burial. No headstone, no funeral procession, just a numbered grave in the corner of a local cemetery. Your name might be written in a ledger, but nowhere that your descendants could easily find. Workhouses kept costs low, even in death. Some inmates left letters begging their children never to allow them to be buried as a pauper. Others simply disappeared from family records, their final years confined behind stone walls and iron gates. The critics stir. Despite its popularity among reformers and politicians, the workhouse system did not go unchallenged. Writers, doctors, and religious leaders raised concerns about its cruelty and effectiveness. Charles Dickens, in particular, savaged the system in his novels. In Oliver Twist, the titular orphan is born in a workhouse, denied second helpings of gruel, and nearly starved into criminality. Dickens used fiction to spotlight what policy tried to hide: the dehumanization of the vulnerable. Other reformers, like the Quakers or local vicars, wrote pamphlets, offered outdoor relief in defiance of policy, or created model workhouses with better food, more humane treatment, and basic medical care. But these were exceptions. For most, the standard remained one of hardship, separation, and silence. A system set in stone. By the mid-19th century, there were over 600 workhouses across England and Wales. They had become institutional, routine, part of the landscape. Generations passed through them, some never leaving. And even as critics grew louder, many in power remained unmoved. The system, after all, worked as designed. It discouraged idleness, kept costs low, and enforced a moral code. That it also punished the innocent was seen as an acceptable price. So we are left with a question. When a system claims to help but strips away dignity, is it truly help at all? A system under scrutiny. By the 1860s, the workhouse system had become so deeply entrenched in British society that few could imagine life without it. Yet discontent was growing not from within Parliament, but from the margins. Journalists, doctors, religious reformers, and even some local poor law guardians began to question whether the system actually served its purpose. The idea that poverty was always the result of moral weakness no longer held up to scrutiny. Observers saw something far more mundane and tragic: people crushed not by laziness, but by bad harvests, factory layoffs, illness, and accident. The cracks were widening. Scandals behind the walls. A turning point came in 1865 in the small Yorkshire town of Andover. A local journalist uncovered that inmates at the Andover workhouse were so underfed, they had resorted to gnawing on the bones they were assigned to crush into fertilizer. Even more horrifying, some of those bones were allegedly human purchased in bulk from hospitals and graveyards. The public was outraged. The ensuing government inquiry revealed not just one scandal, but systemic neglect. Guardians who skimmed from food budgets, workhouse masters who administered beatings, children kept in filthy dormitories, and elderly inmates left to die in silence. Andover was not unique. It was simply the one that got caught. The Poor Law Board reacts. Under pressure, the Poor Law Board, Britain's national authority over the system, began to respond. It issued new guidelines on nutrition, housing, and cleanliness. It encouraged inspections and promoted the appointment of trained workhouse masters and matrons. But real change was slow. Many boards of guardians were local landowners or tradesmen who saw the workhouse more as a burden than a duty. Budgets remained tight. Corruption was common. And so reformers turned to a new approach: change from within. The rise of the workhouse doctor. In the 1870s, medical professionals began to play a larger role in workhouse life. Every institution was now required to appoint a workhouse medical officer, usually a local doctor contracted to provide care to inmates. These doctors saw firsthand what few outsiders did: the raw suffering of the poor, malnutrition, chronic illness, mental breakdowns, children with rickets, women with untreated infections, elderly men dying of bronchitis in unheated wards. Many doctors wrote about these conditions, submitting reports that later helped shape public health legislation. Some even became activists in their own right. Workhouse infirmaries, hospitals in disguise. Gradually, a new function of the workhouse began to emerge: the infirmary. While most people feared the workhouse, many could not afford medical care elsewhere. As a result, workhouse infirmaries increasingly served as the only hospital available to the poor. Initially understaffed and grim, these infirmaries began to professionalize in the late 19th century. Some were taken over by voluntary hospital administrators. Others rebranded themselves as public hospitals to shed the stigma of the workhouse. Still, the line was blurry. A man with tuberculosis might be admitted to a workhouse infirmary and never leave. His care might be technically free, but the price was dignity. The workhouse and the women's movement. The workhouse was particularly cruel to women. Single mothers faced intense scrutiny. Unmarried and pregnant, you were labeled a moral failure. Your child would be born in the workhouse, likely registered without a father, and you might never live outside its walls again. Widows, too, were vulnerable. With no male wage earner, many entered the workhouse simply because no other option existed. These realities sparked action. Early women's rights groups took up the cause of female paupers, highlighting the double burden of poverty and gender discrimination. Writers like Elizabeth Gaskell and Octavia Hill portrayed the workhouse in essays and fiction, urging Victorian society to rethink its assumptions about morality, labor, and maternal suffering. Education and the workhouse child. For children, the workhouse could be a life sentence or a fragile reprieve. Some were transferred to industrial schools, where they learned trades like shoemaking, carpentry, or needlework. A few rose to better lives apprenticed out, adopted, or sent to colonial settlements. Others remained institutionalized, cycling between workhouse schools and labor placements, never experiencing family life or affection. They were often seen not as children, but as future laborers in training. In 1870, the Elementary Education Act made schooling compulsory for all children, including those in the workhouse. It was a major step. For the first time, children had a right to literacy and learning, even if they lived behind iron gates. But education could not undo the loneliness of separation. or the shame of being labeled a workhouse child. A changing attitude. By the end of the 19th century, attitudes were shifting. The once dominant belief that poverty was a moral failure had weakened. New scientific ideas, sociology, epidemiology, and public health suggested that poverty was often caused by environmental factors. Slum housing bred disease. Industrial work caused injury. Irregular employment meant sudden destitution. The liberal government of the early 1900s introduced new policies that aimed to prevent poverty rather than punish it. These included old age pensions, 1908, national insurance for health and unemployment, 1911, free school meals and medical inspections for children. These weren't welfare as we know it today, but they signaled a break from the punitive mindset of the workhouse. The workhouse in decline. As these reforms expanded, the workhouse began to lose its central role. Admissions dropped. Public distaste grew. More and more people received outdoor relief against small stipends or services that allowed them to remain in their homes. The Local Government Act of 1929 formally abolished the poor law system. Workhouses were renamed public assistance institutions. Many were converted into hospitals, elder care homes, or administrative centers. But the architecture remained. The walls, the iron gates, the separation of men, women, and children they endured. And with them, the memory. The cost of waiting. The workhouse did not end because it failed. It ended because people changed in how they viewed poverty, government, and the role of compassion in policy. But the transition took nearly a century. Generations lived and died behind those stone walls before relief arrived. And so a question lingers. How long should a society tolerate suffering before it decides that suffering is unacceptable? A name that lingered. Even after the Local Government Act of 1929 officially ended the poor law system in Britain, the word workhouse remained. Many of the buildings continued to function, some as public hospitals, others as infirmaries or old-age homes. The signage changed, but the stigma did not. People still referred to these places as workhouses. The association with punishment, with desperation, with being on the parish, remained as thick as the mortar between the stones. Inmates who had lived their final years in these institutions were often buried in paupers' graves, even into the 1940s. Some families avoided speaking of relatives who had died in the workhouse. Others invented alternative stories to shield themselves from shame. Though the system was being dismantled, its cultural residue endured. Wartime realities and post-war resolve. The world wars reshaped Britain. Soldiers returned to civilian life demanding not just medals, but security. Families that had suffered through the Depression and the Blitz felt that the old systems of poverty relief were no longer acceptable. In 1942, the Beveridge Report laid the groundwork for a new kind of Britain, one that would wage war not only against enemies abroad, but against the 5 giant evils: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. It was a conscious rejection of the poor law mindset. Beveridge insisted that the state had a duty to protect citizens from cradle to grave. Poverty was no longer seen as a moral failure, but as a failure of opportunity, of access, of fairness. The report captivated the public. When the war ended, the newly elected Labor government acted swiftly. The birth of the welfare state. In 1948, the National Assistance Act abolished the remnants of the old poor law once and for all. Any lingering workhouses were either closed or converted into modern facilities. Alongside this, the National Health Service, NHS, was created, ensuring free medical care for all, regardless of income. Public housing, family allowances, and unemployment benefits followed. The social safety net was being woven anew this time, without barbed wire and gatekeepers. The guiding idea was dignity. No more stone walls, no more gruel, no more uniforms. And yet, ghosts in the system. Though the institutions disappeared, their logic occasionally crept back in attitudes, in policies, in quiet prejudices. Even in the modern welfare state, some continued to view claimants with suspicion. Media depictions of benefits cheats, or scroungers, echoed Victorian fears of the undeserving poor. Bureaucratic systems sometimes grew cold, impersonal, or punitive. Waiting rooms in job centers could feel austere. Housing inspections could feel intrusive. Forms became long, requirements complex. The fear of encouraging dependency still shaped debate. The ghost of the workhouse, the belief that help must be unpleasant to discourage overuse, still whispered in policy. Memory in architecture. Across Britain, many former workhouses still stand. Some are hospitals, some are apartments, some lie abandoned, their windows broken and weeds pushing through the stones. In Liverpool, the Brownlow Hill workhouse, once housing over 3,000 inmates, was demolished in the 20th century, but its foundations still lie beneath university buildings. In London, the Cleveland Street Workhouse building still stands, once rumored to be the birthplace of Charles Dickens. Some of these buildings have plaques. A few have been turned into museums, but many pass unnoticed, unmarked relics of a past many would rather forget. The workhouse in popular culture. Literature and film have kept the workhouse in the public imagination. In Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, the request for more became symbolic of both innocence and rebellion. In musicals, the workhouse appears as a place of cruelty and constraint. In documentaries, elderly interviewees sometimes speak of being put in the workhouse as children. Their voices tremble not from the cold, but from the memory. These cultural portrayals have helped generations understand the cruelty of the system without having lived it, and in doing so, they helped shape modern expectations. That help should be humane, not humiliating. What the workhouse teaches us. The story of the workhouse isn't just a tale of cruelty. It's also a story of resistance, reform, and resilience. It teaches us that poverty is rarely a personal failure, it is most often structural. Dignity is not a luxury, it is the foundation of meaningful aid. Systems matter, but so do the values they are built upon. It also shows us that social progress is often painfully slow, that it takes generations of struggle, exposure, writing, organizing, and remembering to dismantle systems of oppression. And that even when the walls come down, the shame can linger, unless we name it and face it. A final reflection. The workhouse may be gone, but its lesson remains. Helping the vulnerable is not a burden. It is the measure of a just society. And so, when modern institutions flirt with old ideas when they weigh worthiness over need, or design systems that confuse, delay, or discourage, we should remember those iron gates, those silent wards, those ledger entries where names became numbers. We should remember that poverty is not a crime. And we should ask ourselves, do we design our systems to lift people up or to keep them out? Story 6. Railway Mania, a nation on the move. A new sound in the countryside. It was once only the breeze and the birds that disturbed the English countryside. Then, in the early 1830s, came a sound like no other, a deep rumble that grew into a metallic clatter, a whistle piercing the mist, and a black column of smoke carving its way through the hedgerows. The railway engine had arrived. To villagers standing by their stone fences, it seemed almost supernatural. A mechanical serpent pulling iron boxes filled with people and goods. Where once a journey took days by stagecoach, the train made it in hours. And so began the railway age, an era not only of technology and transport, but of mania. Before the rails, before trains, Britain's transportation system was slow, unreliable, and localized. Roads were often muddy, deeply rutted, or impassable in winter. Canal transport had made some improvement, especially for heavy goods like coal, but it was slow and limited to where waterways existed. A trip from London to Manchester by coach could take 4 days. Freight moved at a crawl. Mail delivery was inconsistent. For many, the outside world remained a rumor. The dawn of the railway would alter that forever, not just changing travel, but changing time, distance, and the very idea of movement. Steam and ambition. At the heart of this transformation stood the steam engine. Engineers like Richard Trevithick and George Stephenson had developed high-pressure steam engines that could power locomotives over metal tracks. In 1825, Stephenson's Stockton and Darlington Railway became the first public railway to carry passengers. It was a modest beginning, just 12 miles, but it marked a revolution. Then came the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830, the first fully timetabled intercity railway using steam locomotives. It was fast, efficient, and wildly popular. People began to imagine a future in which all of Britain might be connected by rails. And so they invested. A frenzy of speculation. By the early 1840s, railway construction was no longer a cautious innovation, it was an obsession. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. Landowners sold rights of way. Investors poured money into companies, many of them speculative, some outright fraudulent. This was the period historians call railway mania. Between 1844 and 1847, more than 1,000 railway companies were proposed. The number of bills presented to Parliament for new lines surged. In 1 year alone, 1846, there were proposals for more than 9,000 miles of track, much of it redundant or impractical. Shares were bought and sold feverishly. Clerks, shopkeepers, and retired soldiers sank their savings into what seemed a guaranteed profit. The promise was simple: fast transport meant economic growth. But the rails hadn't even been laid. Parliament gets involved. With so many proposed lines crisscrossing the nation, Parliament stepped in not to stop the mania, but to regulate and approve it. Each railway required an individual Act of Parliament to grant compulsory land purchases. The House of Commons became flooded with railway maps and debates. The process was chaotic. MPs were lobbied heavily. Engineers competed for prestige. Routes were adjusted, abandoned, or redrawn depending on political pressure or local protests. And behind it all, landowners either cashed in or resisted fiercely. Some demanded absurd prices for narrow strips of land. Others insisted on conditions: no noise near their homes, no trains on Sundays, or even mandatory planting of trees to hide the tracks from view. Still, the tracks advanced. Building the network. Railway construction was grueling, dangerous, and labor-intensive. It was carried out by thousands of navvies, short for navigators, many of them itinerant laborers from Ireland, Wales, and rural England. They lived in makeshift camps, moved from site to site, and worked in all weather. Cuttings were dug by hand, tunnels bored through hills, viaducts were raised over valleys, rails were laid one iron bar at a time. There were accidents, many of them fatal, but the work continued. By the mid-1840s, Britain was a nation under construction. The reaction of the public. The arrival of the railway transformed daily life, and not everyone welcomed it. Some farmers feared that cows would stop giving milk near the noise of locomotives. Others warned that the speed of travel, sometimes as fast as 30 miles per hour, could be harmful to the human body or mind. A few called it ungodly. Sunday rail services were especially controversial, with religious groups protesting their impact on the Sabbath. Meanwhile, in cities and towns, people marveled. Crowds gathered at stations to watch trains depart. Some took short journeys simply for the novelty. The first railway excursions, day trips to the seaside or countryside, began to take shape. It was the beginning of mass tourism. The collapse of the bubble. All manias end, and railway mania was no exception. By 1847, the market collapsed. Many of the proposed lines had never been built, and those that had were far more expensive than expected. Profits fell short. Some companies folded, others merged in desperation. Thousands of investors lost everything. It was a sobering lesson. The future had arrived, but not everyone would profit from it. Still, even as the bubble burst, the rails remained, and with them a new era of connectivity, commerce, and commuting. A transformation in progress. By the early 1850s, the railway network, though not as vast as originally dreamed, had become a permanent fixture of British life. Goods could be moved in hours instead of days, markets expanded, prices stabilized. Fresh food from distant farms appeared in urban markets. The daily newspaper, printed in London, arrived in Manchester the same morning. And yet, the full impact of this transformation had only begun to unfold. Because the railways did more than move people, they reshaped space, time, and society. An unfinished journey. The nation had laid its tracks, built its stations, and weathered its bubble. But deeper questions remained. How would the railway change class dynamics when the poor could now travel cheaply? How would towns transform when suddenly they were connected to London? Would rural life fade or adapt? And perhaps most importantly, if a machine could compress time and space, what would it do to the people who lived within them? The timetable takes hold. Before the railways, time in Britain was a local affair. Noon in Bristol wasn't the same as noon in London. Each town followed its own solar time, set by the church clock or the local watchmaker. But trains could not operate on shifting standards. A passenger waiting for the 10:03 to Leeds needed to know precisely what that meant, whether they were in Leeds or London. The solution was revolutionary: railway time. It began as a convenience but soon became a national standard. By the 1850s, clocks in major towns were reset to Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, first for trains, then for post, eventually for all public life. Time itself had been unified by iron rails. Social class on the rails. The railway opened Britain, but not equally. First-class carriages were luxuriously appointed, with padded seats, glass windows, and sometimes even foot warmers. They were meant for the upper middle class and gentry, those who could afford comfort and privacy. Second class was plainer wooden seats, no heat but sheltered. Third class, especially in the early years, could be brutal: open-air wagons with no roof, no seats, and no protection from the elements. Passengers sat on wooden benches or stood for hours, exposed to rain, wind, and soot. Yet for many laborers, third class was a revelation. For a few shillings, they could visit distant relatives, attend job fairs, or even see the sea for the first time. By the 1850s, the Cheap Trains Act required companies to offer at least one affordable third-class train per day. It was a quiet but profound moment. For the first time, mobility was no longer a privilege, it was a right. The rise of commuting. As rails stretched out from major cities, they made possible something new: living far from where one worked. Before trains, most people lived within walking distance of their jobs. But now, a clerk could live in Croydon and work in London. A textile buyer in Manchester might commute from a nearby village. The concept of the commuter was born. Not only did this reshape cities, creating suburbs and swelling towns near junctions, it also began to define work-life balance in an entirely new way. Trains imposed order. You rose at 6:30 to catch the 7:15. You knew your return train. Your evenings were now shaped not by light but by schedule. Punctuality became not just a virtue, it became a necessity. Commerce on the move. The railways didn't just carry people, they carried everything. Farmers could send fresh milk to the city. Fishmongers could sell coastal catches inland. Textile manufacturers moved goods faster. Coal and iron, once limited to barge or cart, now flowed freely across the island. Markets expanded, prices stabilized. New industries flourished not just because of production, but because of distribution. Shops began to stock imported fruits. Newspapers arrived the same day. Regional isolation began to fade. You could now run a business from afar, coordinating production in one place and sales in another. The railways became the veins and arteries of the British economy. Tourism and the birth of leisure travel. In 1841, a Baptist cabinetmaker named Thomas Cook organized a train excursion for 500 temperance supporters from Leicester to Loughborough. The idea, a group trip by rail for pleasure. It was a success. Within years, Cook was running regular excursion trains to seaside resorts like Brighton, Blackpool, and Scarborough. His company offered packages, tickets, meals, even guides. It was the birth of mass tourism. Working-class families could now afford a day at the seaside. They traveled with picnic baskets, donned bathing suits, and returned sunburned and giddy. The idea of a holiday, once the domain of the rich, was democratized. Railways made escape possible. New towns lost villages. The railway shaped not only movement, but geography itself. Towns near lines boomed. Those bypassed often withered. A station could mean prosperity, its absence stagnation. Places like Crewe and Swindon became major hubs solely because they were selected as junctions or maintenance depots. Populations exploded. New housing, shops, and schools sprang up overnight. Some villages petitioned desperately to have a station built. Others fought against it, fearing noise, strangers, and moral decline. The map of Britain began to change. No longer was importance determined by location alone, it was determined by connectivity. Resistance and fear. Not all welcomed this new world. Writers warned of moral decay, with working-class youth traveling freely and returning with radical ideas. Farmers lamented the intrusion of rails through fields and hedgerows. Poets mourned the loss of rural quiet. The railway represented not just progress but disruption. Critics called trains monsters. Letters to newspapers described cows panicking at whistles, horses bolting, and even rumors of children driven mad by the speed. But despite fears, rail travel became routine. Stations became part of every landscape. Whistles became background noise. Speed became normal. And the old world slowly yielded to the new. The iron web. By the 1860s, the railway network spanned thousands of miles. It touched every major city, most towns, and many villages. You could travel from Penzance to Perth, stopping in Birmingham, York, or Carlisle along the way. You could send a letter, a crate of goods, or a whole family with near-clockwork precision. The nation became an interconnected machine, an iron web laced across green hills and gray towns. With it came faster communication, new ideas, political coordination, even national identity. The rails shrank the country. They wove it together. And yet beneath the clatter and steam, questions remained. What was being lost, as so much was being gained? After the rush. By the late 1860s, the British railway system had largely matured. The fever of railway mania had cooled. The great speculative bubble had burst 2 decades earlier, leaving in its wake thousands of disappointed investors, bankrupt companies, and half-built tracks rusting in the rain. And yet the bones of the railway remained. Tracks were laid, stations were built, towns had grown around junctions. What emerged from the chaos was not the grand vision of endless profit, but something perhaps more meaningful, a transportation system that connected a nation. The mania had ended, but the movement never stopped. The age of the giants. In the decades following the initial frenzy, the industry underwent massive consolidation. Hundreds of small railway companies, many redundant or financially weak, were merged or absorbed into larger ones. By the end of the 19th century, just a handful of major regional companies dominated. Great Western Railway, GWR. London and North Western Railway, LNWR. Midland Railway. Great Northern Railway, GNR. Southeastern Railway. These giants operated like empires, each with its own branding, rolling stock, and elaborate stations. They competed for passengers and freight, often duplicating services or building parallel routes in pursuit of dominance. The result was an uneven patchwork, fast and frequent in some areas, neglected and sparse in others. Still the trains ran. Railways and empire. Britain's industrial strength increasingly depended on transportation, and the railways delivered. They carried coal to ports, raw cotton to mills, and finished goods to market. They enabled the rapid movement of troops, the distribution of mail, and the consolidation of colonial goods flowing in and out of London, Liverpool, and Glasgow. Railways became part of the imperial system not only at home, but abroad. British engineers, having perfected railway construction domestically, went on to build vast networks in India, Africa, and Southeast Asia, exporting the model of connectivity and control. Wherever the British Empire expanded, railway lines followed symbols of both efficiency and authority. Crashes and controls. While consolidation brought stability, it also bred monopoly. Some companies colluded to fix prices. Others treated passengers and freight customers with indifference, knowing they had no alternatives. Accidents, too, were common. With increased traffic came deadlier collisions, especially when different companies used shared tracks with incompatible signaling systems. Public pressure mounted for safety improvements. In response, Parliament passed a series of regulations, including the Regulation of Railways Act, 1871, which allowed the government to investigate serious accidents. Requirements for standardized brakes, signals, and communication systems. Mandates for safety reporting and driver training. A pattern emerged. Private innovation, followed by public regulation, a dance that would define transport for decades to come. A new kind of journey. As the 19th century closed, train travel became not just common, but ordinary. Tickets were affordable. Stations stood proudly in every town. Children grew up knowing the smell of coal smoke and the sound of whistles. Students commuted to school. Workers to factories. Families to holiday resorts. Courting couples met on platforms. Letters and parcels arrived within hours. The railway no longer belonged to the elite or the adventurous. It belonged to everyone. The landscape changed accordingly. City suburbs grew, coastal towns thrived. London sprawled outward along rail lines like ink soaking into cloth. The railway had redrawn the map not just physically, but socially. Challenges of modernity. Yet by the early 20th century, new challenges emerged. The motor car and the bus began to eat into railway revenues, offering flexible routes and personal convenience. Lorries challenged freight services. Roads improved. The railway companies struggled to compete, their operations often bloated and resistant to change. World War I strained the network to its limits, with the government taking temporary control to coordinate logistics. After the war, calls grew for permanent nationalization. The result in 1923 was the grouping, a restructuring that merged most lines into the Big Four. Great Western Railway, GWR. London, Midland and Scottish Railway, LMS. London and North Eastern Railway, LNER. Southern Railway, SR. These companies operated until after World War II, when nationalization finally arrived in 1948 under British Railways. The private dream had ended, the public era had begun. End of the line. In time, parts of the vast network faded. As cars became dominant, many branch lines and rural stations were closed. The famous beaching cuts of the 1960s removed over 4,000 miles of track and 2,300 stations, attempting to streamline a system built for a different century. Entire communities were left isolated. Yet the core survived, and in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the railways saw a revival not as relics, but as solutions to urban congestion, climate change, and the need for efficient mass transit. Old stations were restored. Steam trains became heritage attractions. Electrification and high-speed lines hinted at a new future. The railways never really died, they simply changed direction. A legacy forged in iron. Today, Britain's railway system is both admired and critiqued. Delays, rising fares, and fragmented services frustrate passengers, yet millions still ride the rails daily. The Victorian network, much of it still in use, remains a testament to 19th century ambition. It reminds us of what happens when imagination, capital, and engineering collide. It warns us of speculation and monopoly, and it proves, again and again, that movement shapes society. The train is no longer novel, but the freedom it unlocked continues to reverberate in how people live, work, travel, and dream. A final reflection. The railway connected more than cities. It connected people, ideas, ambitions, and fates. It blurred class lines, reshaped time, and built the modern world with bolts and rails. And it left behind a question that still echoes through every platform and tunnel. When technology makes the world smaller, what do we gain? And what do we leave behind?